What is pragmatism?
Pragmatism is a distinctively American philosophy that originated in community discussion groups and came to define the philosophy department at Harvard University during the late 19th century. While not as scientific in perspective as some philosophy in Europe during the same time, it represented an effort to think in a practical way.
How and why was Locke's idea of the social contract different from Hobbes'?
Locke held that the social contract was an agreement between citizens or their representatives and the government or king. Because basic amenities of human life and its fundamental social institutions were present before the social contract, government was not as essential in Locke's view, as it had been in Hobbes'. Human society existed and functioned well before government. And if government dissolved or if the governed brought it down for just reasons, society would still exist. However, if something destroyed society, that would also destroy the government.
How did George Berkeley's theory of vision relate to the concept of matter and physical existence?
Berkeley is well known for his theory of vision that contributed so much to modern psychology of perception. However, in that theory he completely repudiated the primary bastion of empiricism, namely, matter. Berkeley departed from both common sense and science in elaborately insisting that matter, the entire physical world based on our best evidence, simply did not exist in the way that the other empiricists Hobbes, Locke and Hume, and later on, John Stuart Mill and Bertrand Russell assumed that it did. For any serious student of the history of philosophy, Berkeley is either a delightful aberration or an intractable obstacle because of this position.
In his case, it was, why should a human being not commit suicide?
The question arose for him from his apprehension of the human condition as absurd. Together with the absence of God and a forever frustrated search for meaning. Camus was a friend of Jean-Paul Sartre, 1905-1980, but they became alienated from each other as a result of Camus' critique of communist tyranny in his essay In Favor of Revolutionary Struggle, The Rebel, 1951. His novel The Plague, 1947, dramatized the ever-presence of death in human life. In his non-fiction essay The Myth of Sisyphus, 1942, Camus claims that meaning can be found by affirming the absurd and then rebelling against it, as in Imagine Sisyphus Happy. Sisyphus' punishment by Zeus consists of eternally rolling a large boulder up a mountain, only to begin again after he has reached the top and the boulder has rolled down again. His crimes were first to put death in chains and then escape death himself. Camus was awarded the Nobel Prize for Literature in 1957. His own death in a car crash raised the question of his suicide. Paul Ricoeur, 1913 to 2005, wrote on a variety of subjects, including existentialism, phenomenology, ethics, psychology, and theory of language. All of his work was distinguished by a deep engagement with key figures in the history of philosophy. His Freedom and Nature, 1950, was received as a rejection of Sartre's theory of freedom. Ricoeur argued that willing always has an involuntary component, which works as a kind of built-in resistance. What is voluntary consists of motive, decision, and consent, each of which has its own involuntary moment. The involuntary moments include birth, death, character already developed, the body, and the unconscious. First, it's not clear that Sartre equated freedom with acts of will, because freedom is present in all consciousness. Second, Sartre would have said that what we accept or recognize as involuntary requires a free choice of bestowing that particular meaning.
What was Michel Foucault's method for forming his cultural criticism?
Foucault studied institutions and ideas by understanding their histories. In the course of that anthropological archaeology, he often pinpointed the emergence of new forms of human discourse and personal identity. In the case of sexuality, for example, Foucault argued that new forms of power create new forms of sexuality, as do new practices of observation and medical diagnosis. One of Foucault's most enduring contributions was to demonstrate how many human traits and practices that are believed to be natural are in fact the effects of social and political institutions that exert unexamined power on individuals. At the same time, the individuals are complicit in remaking themselves to conform to institutional expectations. A primary example would be ideas of gender such as athletic ability in women. Before the second half of the 20th century, women were believed to be unable to participate or excel in sports due to natural limitations. Foucault is famous for having claimed to invert Plato, c. 428 c. 348 BCE, who had said that the soul is imprisoned in the body, meaning that our natural physical needs and desires oppress our higher spiritual selves. Foucault thought that the soul is the prison of the body, meaning that our ideas shape our physical existence.
Does everyone now believe the scientific revolution was good for humanity?
Few can deny the value of an objective, factual understanding of the natural world. Modern technology that resulted from this knowledge has prolonged life, added to comfort, and made all human beings more mobile. There is also an understanding that knowledge should be open and that science is subject to revision. which goes back to the early days of the Royal Society. However, in the second half of the 20th century, the objectivity of early modern science and its values were questioned by historians and cultural critics. Concerning the high value placed on experimentation, for example, it has been discovered that many of the experiments reported by Galileo, 1564 to 1642, and Boyle, 1627-1691, were thought experiments from which they deduced the facts, instead of having directly observed them. And Newton, 1643 to 1727, himself did not actually base his three laws of motion on experimental data, as much as he logically deduced them from more abstract theoretical commitments. On the cultural side, Francis Bacon's, 1561 to 1626, perspective was based on assumptions that Earth and its creatures were all raw material for the manipulation and use of mankind. There was no sense that nature had value in its own right. In addition, some feminist critics have viewed the scientific revolution as a radical turn away from an ancient and medieval view of Earth as a living, organic whole, or mother to all who lived on it. They claim that this change in perspective privileged aggression and violence as virtues, compared to harmony and nurturance. Many crafts such as tanning, dyeing, and brewing, but most important, midwifery, became closed to women, as male practitioners took them over. Based on more scientific principles, and moved them out of private households.
How did John Stuart Mill define the difference between higher and lower pleasures?
Mill did not think that a simple quantitative calculus could be used to make moral decisions. He argued that there were lower pleasures that were mainly connected with immediate physical gratification and delight, and higher pleasures that involved delayed gratification or prior diligence. The higher pleasures, such as those found in the cultivation and enjoyment of art, literature, poetry, and friendship, were better than the lower pleasures. Mill's proof that they were better was the testimony of those who had experienced both the lower and higher pleasures.
What was Alexius Meinung's theory of value?
Our emotions and desires have a cognitive ability to discern value. This does not mean that our emotions and desires can think, but that they tell us something about the world, often faster than our minds. Objects, those things intended by us, present themselves with value features. For instance, the smell of the apple directs me to eat it. It has the value of being good to eat. Or a sunset presents itself as beautiful. A property that does not reduce to facts about the refraction of light or the amount of pollution in the air. There are also value universals, such as the good, the beautiful, the agreeable, the desirable, and different kinds of the obligatory, the general category of our duties. Meinong distinguished between dignitatives that are associated with ideas of the good, and desideratives associated with ideas of duty.
Did early Neoplatonism include women philosophers?
Yes. Overall, Christianity emphasized the importance of the individual immortal soul. And although the church was run by men and its dominant theologians were male, the religious lives and work of women had a recognized place in schools and convents. This change was first evident in the Neoplatonist movement.
How did Spinoza consider good and evil?
Spinoza sought to consider human actions and desires objectively, almost like mathematical questions. Virtuous actions result from understanding and are either self-preserving or altruistic. But the two are united. Nothing is more useful to man than man. He defined good as what we certainly know to be useful to us, and evil as what we certainly know prevents us from being masters of some good. Because God is perfect, he has no needs, from which it follows that nothing is good or evil to him. God's blessing is not a reward for virtuous behavior, but an inevitable result of living according to reason or having adequate knowledge. Spinoza also held that citizens of a state cannot give up their right to attain their own well-being.
What are Jürgen Habermas' main ideas?
Habermas, 1929, quest has been to find a normative or prescriptive basis for social criticism. As a graduate student, he identified the importance of the public sphere, of political discourse in the 18th century, which did not endure. In his early work, he rejected positivism, Marxism, and the psychoanalytic tradition for their failures to provide a normative foundation. His own goals were liberatory, and he thought that modernity could best be criticized from communicative rationality, or progressive discourse, as opposed to merely instrumental or goal-oriented rationality. Habermas has held that formal pragmatics is necessary to clarify the implicit rules that determine who participates in official and institutional discourse. In criticizing these rules, Habermas' conclusion is that such discourse is biased toward bureaucracy and technology or mastery of nature, which is not limited to capitalism. The correction lies in an ongoing dialectic or public discussion, with the ideal of obtaining the agreement of all interested groups. This pluralistic dialectic is itself an ideal speech situation. Habermas' ideal speech situation is understood by many to be a revival of Enlightenment rationality.
What is Catherine MacKinnon's contribution to second-wave feminist political philosophy?
In the 1970s, Catherine MacKinnon, 1946, began to argue that sexual harassment is a form of sexual discrimination. Outlawed by the 1964 Civil Rights Act. MacKinnon and Andrea Dworkin also developed legal theory to outlaw pornography. The U.S. Supreme Court ruled against sexual harassment in 1986, largely based on MacKinnon's work. And the Supreme Court of Canada has partly accepted her arguments against pornography. MacKinnon's books include, In Harm's Way, The Pornography Civil Rights Hearings. Edited and introduced with Andrea Dworkin, 1997, Toward a Feminist Theory of the State, 1989. Pornography and Civil Rights, A New Day for Women's Equality, with Andrea Dworkin, 1988. Organizing Against Pornography, 1988, Feminism Unmodified, Discourses on Life and Law, 1987. And Sexual Harassment of Working Women, A Case of Sex Discrimination, with Thomas I Emerson, 1979.
What did the dialogue between the pre-Socratics reveal about their philosophy?
The philosophy of the pre-Socratics can be viewed as one big intellectual conversation. We can see the historical development of their ideas and a kind of progress in their thinking over time if we consider them in, more or less, chronological order. A pattern was thus developed as each generation of students carefully examined and criticized the ideas of their teachers, as well as the rivals of their teachers. Ever since the pre-Socratics, philosophers have thought about the ideas of their predecessors and tried to perfect or disprove them.
How did Nicolas Malebranche react to Descartes' mind-body problem?
Nicolas Malebranche denied that anything, either mental or physical, could cause, or be the effect of, anything else. His reasoning was that physical bodies were inert and passive, without any force within them that could cause anything or even sustain movement. Neither can mental things cause anything, because there is no necessary connection between any human act of will and any other event. Only God has an effective will in this sense. Therefore, all causal connections in nature are in reality the actions of God. Causal chains in nature are like two clocks that are 1 minute apart in time. There may be an appearance of the clock that is ahead in time causing the movements of the slower clock. But this is no more than an appearance.
What was Philippa Foot's contribution to virtue ethics?
Philippa Ruth Foot, 1920, who is the granddaughter of U.S. President Grover Cleveland, opposes subjectivism or emotivism in ethics and insists on a connection between morality and rationality. She has tried to undermine a fact/value divide in claiming that moral judgments are determined by facts about our lives and nature. In this sense, she is a moral naturalist. Moral naturalism is the view that what is morally good is not some distinct and special quality but ordinary things and actions that have been rationally chosen as best in a particular set of circumstances. Overall, Foote has consistently supported virtues as conducive to self-interest. Her main publications are Virtues and Vices and Other Essays in Moral Philosophy, 1978. Natural Goodness, 2001, and Moral Dilemmas, and Other Topics in Moral Philosophy, 2002.
What was W. V.O. Quine's holistic view of knowledge?
Quine's holistic view was his positive account of knowledge after he attacked the second dogma of experience. That single statements or parts of a theory can be confirmed independently of each other. Quine thought that all of our scientific and lay theories were interconnected with the most general and abstract truths, for example, the truths of arithmetic in the center of a web. Toward the periphery of this web were more specific generalizations and factual claims that were easier to give up in the face of an experience that contradicted them. It is this aspect of Quine's thought that places him in the tradition of pragmatism.
What was Bernard Bosanquet's aesthetic theory?
Bosanquet, in his A History of Aesthetic, 1892, provided an historical development of beauty. In the ancient world, beauty was imitation. Whereas in Hegel's objective idealist philosophy, beauty is reality itself. Following Immanuel Kant, 1724–1804, he held that we experience objects as beautiful because they present the structures and organizing qualities of reason in perceptible forms.
Who was Johann Gottlieb Fichte?
Johann Gottlieb Fichte, 1762–1814, is regarded as an intellectual bridge between Immanuel Kant, 1724–1804, and Friedrich Hegel, 1770–1831, as well as the founder of the 19th-century school of German idealism.
Did Aristotle lack a sense of humor?
Aristotle's writing style is magisterial, but his surviving texts are uniformly sober and dry, despite their overall common sense. We can't know what he was like personally, although he was described as having been thin and bald, speaking with a lisp, and displaying a sardonic disposition. When he retired to Chalcis, in the wake of anti-Macedonian reactions in Athens after Alexander died. 325 BCE, he is said to have remarked that he did so lest the Athenians should sin twice against philosophy, a thinly veiled reference to the trial of Socrates.
What were Arthur Schopenhauer's main ideas?
Schopenhauer offered an original interpretation of Immanuel Kant's 1724–1804 metaphysics based on additional inspiration. He wrote, "I owe what is best in my own development to the impression made by Kant's works. The sacred writings of the Hindus, and Plato." In his dissertation, he argued that Kant's phenomenal world, or the world of our experience, which Schopenhauer called the world of representation, obeys the principle of sufficient reason. Which he stated this way: every possible object stands in a necessary relation to other objects. On the one hand as determined, on the other as determining. That is, everything is both a cause and an effect, and these relations are necessary. Which is to say that they cannot be denied without logical contradiction. Kant's noumenal world, or the things in themselves, of which we can know nothing except that they exist, became knowable, according to Schopenhauer, through our inner reality, which is our will. Again following Kant, because mathematics or numbers are projections of the mind that enable us to experience phenomena. Schopenhauer felt that the noumenal world has no number, it is one. This claim would have no consequences in experience if it were true, since it is an effort to describe what underlies experience.
Did any of the early modern male philosophers consider the position of women in their writing?
Yes. René Descartes, 1596–1650, deliberately wrote his Discourse on Method, 1637, in French. In part so that women, who were not usually taught Latin, would be able to read it. Hobbes considered women to be just as strong and free as men in the original state of nature, and talked about their consent being necessary to enter into marriage. He also referred to the power of women when he called them Lord Mothers, to whom their children were obligated if they had nurtured and raised them, instead of abandoning them to fortune. John Locke, 1632–1704, thought that the doctrine of the divine right of kings, which was based on heredity from Adam, simply left out the existence of female parents. He described marriage as a partnership for the sake of procreation and raising children, and suggested that once children were grown, the husband and wife could go their separate ways if they chose. In his Thoughts Concerning Education, 1693, written in response to his cousin's questions about how young men should be raised, Locke wrote that girls should receive basically the same education as boys.
Why did Vico oppose Cartesianism?
Vico concluded that René Descartes, 1596–1650, had been too enamored of mathematics and natural philosophy. Science, to the neglect or dismissal of art, law, and history as valid fields of knowledge. Vico also did not think that Descartes was right in seeking the same kind of certain knowledge in science that mathematics yielded. In his first book, On the Ancient Italian Knowledge, 1710, Vico argued that Descartes was wrong in holding awareness of his own existence as a first philosophical principle, and in trying to prove God's existence through reason alone. Vico's own view was that the mind does not make itself and, for that reason, cannot know how it has knowledge of itself. Concerning mathematical and even scientific certainty, Vico did not think we can arrive at it through clear and distinct ideas, as Descartes claimed. He claimed that mathematical knowledge is certainly true because the human mind has created the very standard for mathematical truth, or because we have made mathematics. However, God has made the physical universe, and only He can have certain knowledge about that. Vico did concede that when we do make things in nature, or through scientific experiment, we can gain knowledge from the confirmation of our hypotheses.
Why aren't there any women philosophers from ancient Greece and Rome who became well known?
The history of Western philosophy has been dominated by men for several reasons. 1. Until the 20th century, few women were systematically educated in ways that enabled the practice of philosophy. 2. Women's family and social roles did not afford them the leisure to practice philosophy. And 3. Male philosophers have traditionally seen the field as restricted to men and have sometimes gone to lengths to exclude women. Nevertheless, in every philosophical period some women have been associated with philosophy as practiced by men, and others have been philosophers in their own right. It cannot be known how much of the work of women philosophers has been ignored, forgotten, or never received the attention it deserved because, until the 20th century, little work by women philosophers was preserved or even mentioned as part of the tradition. The ancient period in Greece and Rome was a foundation for this general, male-dominated trend. Upper-class women were sequestered in special quarters in their homes and not educated for public life. Poor women were heavily burdened by motherhood, domestic drudgery, and agricultural work. Women with some leisure might sew, spin, weave, or listen to men converse, but always in their homes, whereas most philosophical interaction occurred in public places. Overall, women in ancient times rarely had the rights accorded to men. Nevertheless, the names and philosophical work of a small number of women philosophers in antiquity have survived.
Who were the early 17th century freethinkers after Montaigne?
The freethinkers after Montaigne, 1533 to 1592, combined Pyrrhonic skepticism with anti-Aristotelianism against both religious orthodoxy and traditional authority. The most famous freethinkers, or libertines erudites, were Gabriel Naudé, 1600 to 1653, Guy Patin, 1601 to 1672. François de la Mothe l'Éveilleur, 1588 to 1672, Pierre Gassendi, 1592 to 1655, and Isaac La Peyrère, 1588 to 1672. Naudé and Patin were humanists with little interest in scientific claims. But La Mothe l'Éveilleur took up skepticism to undermine scientific knowledge. Out of this group, only Gassendi had a lasting influence on the course of both natural philosophy, what we would today call science, and philosophy proper.
What has been important in second-wave feminist political philosophy?
The concept of patriarchy, or rule by fathers, throughout human history sparked much social and textual analysis, which was brought to theoretical completion by Carol Pateman in The Sexual Contract, 1988. Pateman argued that when modern social contract theory was constructed by Thomas Hobbes, 1588 to 1679, and John Locke, 1632 to 1704, women were left out of the political equation and relegated to private life. Iris Young, 1949 to 2006, a professor of philosophy at the University of Chicago, addressed the connection between female social roles and political structures in Justice and the Politics of Difference, 1990, and Inclusion and Democracy, 2000. Young also addressed women's disempowered bodily comportment in her 1980 essay Throwing Like a Girl, included in a book by the same name in 1990. In addition, feminist philosophers have welcomed and discussed the work of University of Michigan Law School professor Catherine McKinnon.
What was Boyle's method of transdiction?
Boyle, 1627 to 1691, pointed out that our senses are limited, as shown by findings from telescopes and microscopes. He thought that analogy could be used to extend sense knowledge. Atoms or corpuscles could be understood as analogous to objects we can sense. In this sense, atoms have the same principles of action as objects that can be sensed. Boyle backed up his atomic theory with reports of his own experiments, which, based on the premise that atoms exist, confirmed his predictions about gases, solids, and heat.
What are the other American philosophies?
The term here refers to philosophies that represent groups in the Americas that have been politically subordinate to the groups historically represented by the U.S. government. These philosophies themselves have long histories in their cultures of origin. But their concerns have recently become part of Anglo-American mainstream academic philosophy. As a result, new philosophical subfields emerged toward the end of the 20th century. African American, Native American, and Latin American philosophy. Each of these traditions has developed as a form of cultural criticism. And insofar as its analyses of oppression would not immediately be recognized as such by perpetrators, each is a distinctive critical theory.
Has Nicolaus Copernicus' theory withstood the test of time?
The Copernican theory that the Earth and other planets revolve around the Sun is still accepted as true today. Although at first Aristotelians and conservative theologians found the Copernican theory outrageous, the educated papal authorities had a deep interest in science and recognized the explanatory power of the Copernican theory. They tried to get Galileo, who was an enthusiastic supporter of the heliocentric theory, to temper his claims so that the Copernican theory would not contradict religion.
Who is Helen-Sixtus?
Helen-Sixtus, 1937, is best known to philosophers for her The Laugh of the Medusa and Sortes, both 1975. These works constitute an anti-essentialist exhortation for women to reclaim their bodily experience in a new form of feminine writing, écriture féminine. Sixtus has been interpreted to advocate bisexuality and multiplicities of sexuality in ways believed to have prefigured queer theory.
What was Bentham's main proposal for prison reform?
In his Panopticon letters, Jeremy Bentham proposed a new type of prison building so that every prisoner would be under continual observation. He drew elaborate blueprints for this kind of building, which would regulate every aspect of the lives of prisoners. It was intended as a humane but highly effective method for controlling the minds of prisoners.
Augustine's role at the beginning of medieval philosophy?
St. Augustine, Aurelius Augustinus, 354–430, was a pivotal figure in the transition between classical and medieval thought. Some see him as the last of the great classical thinkers, whereas others claim him as the first medieval thinker. He lived through the decline of the Roman Empire, with its political turmoil and military failures, and the Roman state's acceptance of Christianity as the official religion. Just before Augustine died, the Vandals were burning and sacking Hippo, where he was bishop. Augustine's most influential works are Confessions on the Trinity, on Genesis according to the letter, and City of God. They all reflect his own faith after conversion and provide an intellectual structure for much Christian writing that followed. Although Augustine's initial education was in rhetoric, his later studies in Neoplatonism deeply influenced his religious understanding. Still, he approached philosophy in terms of how it could serve religion, rather than as a valuable discipline in its own right. This secondary status of philosophy was widely accepted by philosophers throughout the medieval period. Augustine was one of the early church fathers and was canonized as a saint. By popular acclaim, as was the custom during the early centuries of the Catholic Church.
What topics are addressed in Plato's middle works?
Plato's doctrine of immortality is taken up in the Phaedo, Republic, and Phaedrus. Plato thought that the human soul survives the death of the body. However, the soul's memories of its life are washed clean in the river Lethe. The soul then returns as the soul of another person to live a new life from birth. Also in these works, Plato develops his notion of forms, first introducing them in the Phaedo and going on to define them as eternal, changeless, and immaterial. The relationship between real things to the forms is one of participation. A particular cat that might be your pet, for instance, is a cat because it participates with the form of a cat. While your cat might squint or cough up fur balls, the ideal form cat would not be subject to such irregularities. However, not only neutral and beautiful things have their forms, but everything does. That is, bad cat eyesight and fur balls would also have forms in which they participate. In other words, there is the idea or form of a cat that includes all that makes a cat a cat. And then there is the appearance of your particular pet.
How did the facts of Wollstonecraft's life obscure her work?
Mary Wollstonecraft's life was tumultuous in a way that was shocking to her peers and many later thinkers. Her husband, the philosopher William Godwin, 1756 to 1836, wrote the memoirs of the author of A Vindication of the Rights of Woman a year after Mary had died in childbirth at the age of 37. Godwin, the founder of modern anarchism, was vilified by the poet Robert Southey for the want of all feeling in stripping his dead wife naked. And in a satire called The Unsexed Females, a poem, 1798, published by Richard Polwley. Mary Wollstonecraft was born in Spitalfields, London, and her father squandered their money and took over her own small inheritance. He drank excessively and beat Mary's mother. Her sisters, Everina and Eliza, were also to have unhappy marriages. In her teens, Mary became friends with Jane Arden, whose family had intellectual interests, and Fanny Blood, with whom she later started a school in Newington Green, which was known as a dissenting community. Blood married, became ill, and died. The school fell apart, and Wollstonecraft worked as a governess, leaving after a year when she decided to support herself by writing. This was a very daring ambition for a woman at the time, and Wollstonecraft called herself the first of a new genus. In London, she was assisted by the publisher Joseph Johnson. She became part of a circle that included Thomas Paine and William Godwin, and supported herself by translating French and German texts after learning those languages. She had an affair with the married artist Henry Fuseli, who rejected her when his wife refused a Platonic ménage à trois. She then wrote Vindication of the Rights of Men, 1790, followed by Vindication of the Rights of Women, 1792, and traveled to France a month before Louis XVI was guillotined. There she fell in love with the adventurer Gilbert Imlay, with whom she had her daughter, Fanny. Imlay rejected Mary, and when she returned to England she twice tried to commit suicide. Eventually, she became romantically attached to Godwin and they married so that their child would be legitimate, though they lived in separate houses. Their daughter, Mary, became Mary Shelley, the author of Frankenstein. Fanny committed suicide at the age of 22.
What did Proclus contribute to Neoplatonism?
Proclus, 412 to 485, wrote Elements of Theology and Plato's Theology, which had a lasting effect on subsequent philosophy, particularly that of Hegel, 1770 to 1831, 13 centuries later. He added to the idea of emanations by adding to their downward movements horizontal movements at different stages of their descent. That resulted in a great multiplication of divine entities, or henads, with which Proclus associated Greek deities. He also developed the triadic ruling principle of remaining, preceding, returning. That is, the deity remained what it was while its emanations proceeded downward to ordinary existence. And human understanding of this process and communion with the deity constituted returning. Aside from his spiritual work, Proclus wrote on mathematics, astronomy, physics, and literary criticism.
What was the most striking Native American contribution to American philosophy?
There is growing recognition of the influence of Native American thought on 18th and 19th century Euro-American ideas, as well as later on in history. Contemporary pragmatist scholars have traced contemporary concerns with community well-being in a pluralistic society to early Native American attempts to negotiate with Euro-Americans. Others have identified deeper mainstream American cultural debts to indigenous peoples. Robert Pirsig, the author of Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance, 1974. In his second book, Lila, 1991, draws a fascinating and neglected comparison between what was to become the distinctly direct and plain American style of speech, if not always writing, and speeches in English made by Native American Great Plains leaders. Pirsig quotes 10 Bears, speaking in 1867 to other Native Americans and representatives from Washington. I was born on the prairie, where the wind blew free, and there was nothing to break the light of the sun. I was born where there were no enclosures, and where everything drew a free breath. I want to die there and not within walls. I lived like my father before me. And like them I lived happily. While pragmatists such as John Dewey, 1859 to 1952, were often prolix, their writing was nevertheless direct and innocent of the high style of European abstraction and unnecessary embellishment. Their ideas were not unnecessarily complicated. The same can be said of much New England transcendentalist writing, although maybe not of the St. Louis Hegelians, of the more idealist pragmatists such as Charles Sanders Peirce, 1839 to 1914, and Josiah Royce, 1855 to 1916, or the process philosophers Alfred North Whitehead, 1861 to 1947, and his follower Charles Hartshorne, 1897 to 2000.
Who were the early Neoplatonists?
Plotinus, 205 to 270, founded Neoplatonism in the 3rd century. He wrote most of his work between 253 and 270, and all of it was edited and published by his student Porphyry, 233 to 309. Porphyry's writings on Plotinus were developed and revised in different schools throughout the educated world, including Alexandria, Athens, Syria, and Western Europe. Early Neoplatonism ended with the work of Boethius, full name, Anicius Manlius Severinus Boethius, 480 c. 524, in the 6th century, who attempted to reconcile Plato and Aristotle with Christian theology.
How did ideas about life change when it came to the philosophy of science?
Many notions of a mysterious vitalism, or life force, at the heart of the reproduction of living beings were exchanged for materialist physical accounts after James Watson and Francis Crick discovered the double helix in 1953. Watson and Crick's discovery of the structure of DNA took the mystery out of the idea of life because it could account for the reproduction of genetic material in purely chemical terms. The double helix was a three-dimensional model of the twisted ladder structure of deoxyribonucleic acid DNA, which showed how sequences of acids and bases would replicate themselves through chemical reactions. Watson and Crick's discovery paved the way for gene-based studies in heredity, culminating in the mapping of the human genome, totality of genes, by the early 21st century.
Who was Alain Locke?
Alain Leroy Locke, 1885 to 1954, was the first African-American Rhodes Scholar. He wrote a dissertation in philosophy at Harvard University in 1918, but was told that he would not be hired to teach philosophy, except at a black institution. Locke's dissertation was the problem of classification in the theory of value. Ralph Barton Perry, 1876 to 1957, was his advisor. In 1921 Locke returned to Howard University, where he had previously taught English. To chair the philosophy department, he held that position until 1953. Locke has been primarily remembered for his work in the creation and support of the Harlem Renaissance, and for his writings on black art and music. However, he also developed his studies in pragmatism and applied them to issues of racism and racial identity in complex ways that were only first recovered in the late 20th century. Locke's principal pragmatic philosophical work was When Peoples Meet, a study in race and culture contacts, 1942. Locke's other philosophical writings have since been edited and reinterpreted by Leonard Harris, 1948, and others.
Who was Pierre-Simon Laplace?
Pierre-Simon Laplace, 1749 to 1827, was a mathematician and astronomer who explicated what was to be the classic theory of probability. He taught in Paris at different schools, such as the École Militaire, military school.
Who was Alan Matheson Turing?
Alan Matheson Turing, 1912 to 1954. Was a British cryptologist and mathematician who is credited with founding modern computer science. His Turing machine, which was an extensive thought experiment, formalized the concepts of algorithms and computation. The Turing machine consists of a possibly infinite paper tape with a stream of binary symbols that is continually scanned by a read-write device moving left or right and erasing or writing symbols on the tape, according to a program. Turing showed that any such machine could be programmed to simulate any other one, meaning that it was a universal machine. This universal machine could implement every known mathematical method. He extended this model to machines that cannot be simulated by a universal Turing machine, called oracle machines. Turing proposed that intellectual activity can be understood as networks of universal and non-universal machines that can learn, through training, to become something like universal machines. After the invention of actual electronic computers, Turing suggested that theories of artificial intelligence could be tested. If there were a computer that could perform the same calculations as a human being to the point where a human being could not tell whether the results were produced by the computer or by another human being, then there could theoretically exist artificial intelligence. Turing's 1950 article in Mind, Can Machines Think?, continues to be highly influential in philosophy of mind discussions. In part as a result of John Searle's, 1932, treatment of it.
Who has claimed that animals have rights?
Tom Reagan, 1938, has based a deontological doctrine of the wrongness of killing innocents, including animals, on the premise that they have intrinsic or inherent worth. It follows from this that humans have an obligation not to harm animals, or at least some of them, for recreation, food, or experimentation. Paul W. Taylor, 1923, has extended Reagan's view in claiming that every living thing, from a germ to an elephant, has a teleological center of life that is worthy of moral respect.
What did Descartes do once he was sure of his assertion I am thinking, therefore I exist?
Descartes asked himself what kind of thing he was and concluded that he was a thinking thing. That is, a mind-soul, and not the author of his own being, who must be God. God created both Descartes as an immaterial thinking thing, or soul, and the physical universe that included Descartes' body. There was a second proof for God's existence in Descartes' ontological argument. God was all-powerful and all-good, existence was better than non-existence, therefore God existed. Because God was good, he could not be a deceiver, and the earlier doubts about the existence of the external world and the validity of logic and reason were put to rest. The doubts about sense data could always be corrected by further sense experience. And the distinction between being awake and being asleep could be solved after one was awake and compared the two states. God had made mankind such that our perceptions of the reality of a world that existed could be trusted.
Who was Erich Fromm?
Erich Fromm, 1900 to 1980, established his reputation in political psychology with Escape from Freedom, 1941, which was a condemnation of authoritarian societies. His Art of Loving was an international bestseller in 1956. His distinction between different types of love in that work was a revelation to some Western readers. Fromm drew on the Talmud to extol individuality and criticize totalitarianism. Many of his readers were inspired by his combination of Marxism with psychoanalysis in a way that respected individuality.
What is the school of thought of Buddhism?
The general structure of Buddhism as a school of thought is based on a religious belief in reincarnation, which is known as the will of life. The spiritual ideal is for the individual to stop being reincarnated by adopting behavior with the correct karma, or consequences. The will of life is propelled by the flame of desire. The main obstacle to enlightenment is thereby identified as desire. Desire for people, money, power, fame, objects, and anything else. By following the Eightfold Path, a practitioner will snuff out his or her flame of desire and no longer need to return to this earth. There are three precepts or self-evident truths: that all life is unhappy or unsatisfying, that all life is impermanent, and that there is no eternal or even permanent self or soul. From these precepts, the Eightfold Path manifests itself: right speech, right action, right livelihood, right effort, right mindfulness, right concentration, right views, and right intentions.
What was mitigated or moderate skepticism as explained by Pierre Gassendi?
Pierre Gassendi, 1592–1655, argued that certainty or necessary truths could not be discovered in science. A necessary truth is a belief or statement that it would be logically self-contradictory to deny a necessary truth must be true. Gassendi argued that all we can know is how things appear, not how they are in themselves. In other words, we cannot know the hidden qualities of things. We have no way to reason from what we experience to what has caused our experience. If we have not experienced that cause. Thus, if we have experienced the effect of something, but not the cause itself, we have to admit that we do not know the cause. Nevertheless, we can develop some useful bodies of information about appearances, especially if we augment that knowledge with atomism as a hypothesis. In Syntagma Philosophicum, Gassendi asks if there is any certain criterion to tell truth from falsehood. Clearly, some things are obvious, even to skeptics, such as the sun is shining. It is what is concealed from us that causes difficulty. For example, whether the total number of stars is an odd or even number. Things like that can never be known. But, there are other things that are not evident that we can know by signs. Our perception of sweat, for instance, is a sign that we have pores in our skin. There are also naturally non-evident things such as the hidden fire that causes the smoke we see that we know through indicative signs. While we do not know that the atomic world exists, we can infer it from indicative signs in the world we do perceive. Gassendi thought that it would be needlessly metaphysical to speculate about the property of atoms, such as claiming that they are mathematical. He also insisted that atomic explanations do not apply to the human soul, which he believed was indivisible and immortal, as held by church doctrine.
What happened that affected empiricism in the 19th century?
Empiricism became systematized as an overall philosophical methodology with applications for science, ethics, and political science. This was largely the work of two men who did not agree with each other. William Whewell, 1794–1866, and John Stuart Mill, 1806–1873, and a third, Auguste Comte, 1798–1857, who founded the new school of thought called positivism. Comte was also important in founding sociology, but can be considered here as an empiricist for his methodology. Whewell was primarily focused on science and its popularization. Mill was able to bring a coherent explanation of empirical science into philosophy because his empiricism was more easily accepted by empiricist philosophers than was Whewell's. Mill also extended empiricism to ethics, political philosophy, and rights for women. Comte was the most extreme empiricist to date. And in the 20th century, positivism was revisited as a method for doing philosophy in general.
What is the Tao?
The Tao, or way, advocated by Confucius involves appropriately performing one's roles in the family and society according to Zhen, or loving respect for others. All are presumed to be equal in acting according to Zhen. And if all act in this manner, the whole of society and the world will be improved.
What is Socratic irony?
In both real life and Plato's dialogues, Socrates liked to draw his audience into debate by presenting himself as knowing nothing. The oracle at Delphi had said that there was no man wiser than Socrates. Although Socrates himself always said that he knew nothing. The fact that he knew nothing is said to have set him apart from everyone else. Socrates would begin a dialogue by flattering his interlocutors about their intelligence or virtue. If they were willing to converse with him, a process of careful questioning followed. From such interrogation it would emerge that the person he was talking to knew very little about the subject in which he was supposed to be an expert. In saying at the outset that he himself knew nothing, Socrates had nothing to lose. Whereas his interlocutors would either be personally humiliated or unmasked as hypocrites or charlatans.
What did Parmenides and his Eleatic school believe?
Parmenides of Elea, c. 515 to 450 BCE, together with his two pupils, Zeno, c. 490 430 BCE, and Melissus of Samos. Fluid 440 BCE, formed the Eleatic school. Parmenides had the compelling idea of uniting the ultimate primary substance of everything with our perceived reality that seems to be composed of many different things. He argued forcefully that reality is an undifferentiated whole that is unmoving and unchanging. Parmenides dismissed change and the many different things that human beings ordinarily experience as mere appearance and illusion.